Welcome friends to the second week of English literature for competitive purposes. Today I will be doing or touching upon rather landmarks in English literature and history. So, I would like you to take a look at the given slide. This is part of your exercises today. Identify the poem. Elsped hounds hasten by the score to maul him hide and head. Men drag him in to shore and dogs pronounce him dead. Choose the correct answer here. A. Piers the Plowman. B. The Canterbury Tales. C. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. D. The Pilgrim's Progress. Next, read the following passage. His most acclaimed work, Confessio Amantis, that is, Lover's Confession, is in English, written at the request of Richard II, who was concerned that so little was being written in English. It is a collection of tales and exemplar treating of courtly love. The framework is that of a lover complaining first to Venus and later in the work confessing to her priest genius. The Confessio, completed around 1390, is an important contribution to courtly love literature in English. Some of the stories have their counterparts in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Your choices are: who is being talked about here? A. William Langland. B. John Gower. C. Thomas Malory. D. King John. Next one. Identify the speaker here. It's taken from a famous play. Identify who is the speaker here. And Crispian shall never go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood's cheap while any speaks that fought with us upon Saint Crispin's day. The choices are: A. Richard II, B. Henry IV, C. Henry V, D. Henry VIII. Next, read the quotes below. It's in Old English. I would like you to do the reading yourself. Take 2 minutes and read it. Go through it. Here are your choices. Identify the work. A. Maud Arthur. B. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. C. Piers the Plowman. D. The Canterbury Tales. Next, read the following excerpt. Sweet Son of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. But stay, I see thee in the hemisphere, advanced and made a constellation there. Shine forth, thou star of poets, and with rage or influence shine o'er cheer the drooping stage, which since the flight from hence hath mourned like night, and despairs day but for thy volume's light. Who is the poet here? Your choices are: A. Christopher Marlowe, B. John Donne, C. Ben Jonson, D. Robert Herrick. Next one. Who is the speaker of the following soliloquy? I understand all of you. For now, I'll put on the rowdy behavior of your good for nothing ways. But in this way, I'll be like the sun who allows the vulgar, corrupting clouds to hide his beauty from the world. Then, when the sun wants to be himself again, he breaks through the foul mists and vapors that seem to be strangling him. Who is the speaker? Choose the correct response. A. Hamlet, B. Latus, C. Prince Hal, D. King Lear. Next one. Read the following excerpt. It's from a poem. Her eyes the glowworm lend thee, the shooting stars attend thee, and the elves also, whose little eyes glow like the sparks of fire, befriend thee. No will o' the wisp mislead thee, nor snake or slow worm bite thee, but on thy way, not making a stay, since goes there's none to affright thee. Who is the poet? A. Robert Herrick, B. John Donne, C. Andrew Marvell, D. Edmund Spenser. We discuss the answers now. One is answer is C. It's taken from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Okay, as I have already told you something about this early works. One of the early works on written in the English language. It's a late 14th century alliterative romance recorded in a single manuscript. Remember all these things. We have already discussed Sir Gawain when we are talking about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in one of the earlier classes. So, Sir Gawain also contains 3 other pieces of an altogether more Christian orientation. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written in the in a term that is called alliterative revival of the 14th century. What happens here? Instead of focusing on a metrical syllabic count and rhyme, the alliterative form relied on the agreement of stressed syllables at the beginning of the line with a third and fourth at the end of the line. So, the line always finds a breath point, that is caesura, and we have done all these things earlier. Second one is the answer is B, John Gower. John Gower was the author of Confessio Mentis, poet and friend of Geoffrey Chaucer. He was born around 1330 into a prominent Yorkshire family which held properties in Kent, Yorkshire, Norfolk and Suffolk. So, Gower's coat of arms is identical to those of Sir Robert Gower of Brabant. Nothing is known of his education, though it has been just widely guessed that he was trained in law. So, as I already told you, Geoffrey Chaucer was his great friend, and he dedicated his Troilus and Cresside to Gower, giving him the epithet moral Gower. So, that is the importance of John Gower. The third question, or the third speech, Saint Crispin's Day, is from Henry V, Shakespeare's one of his historicals. Today we are going to touch upon Shakespeare's historicals as well. The fourth one in Old English form is the answer is A, Thomas Malory's The Death of Arthur, Maud Arthur. Fifth is Sweet Poet of Avon, that is written by Ben Jonson, and it's taken from his poem To the Memory of My Beloved Master William Shakespeare. It was composed in 1623. Number 6 is C, Prince Hal. Who is the speaker here? Prince Hal from Henry IV, part 1. And the last one is the lyric kind of poem is, answer is A, by Robert Herrick. It's taken from The Night Piece to Julia. Robert Herrick had written a series of poems dedicated to a fictional lady Julia. To say something about Robert Herrick, he was born on 24th August 1591. His father was a London goldsmith. In 1623, Herrick took his holy orders, and 6 years later he became Vicar of Dean Prior in Devonshire. His position carried a term for a total of 31 years, but during the Great Rebellion in 1647, he was removed from his position because of his royalist sympathies. Herrick was a disciple of Ben Jonson and proudly referred to himself as one of the sons of Ben. Jonson became the subject of 5 of Herrick's poems, and perhaps you may find one of those poems on any of your exams. You should know. So, Ben Jonson, he would write poems in praise of William Shakespeare, and Herrick in praise of Ben Jonson. Remember that. Although all of Herrick's poems praise Jonson as an artist, the first 2 to appear in Hesperides, that is a title of a collection of poems, Hesperides, upon Master Ben Jonson epigram, and another are they are quite ambivalent, whether he treated Ben Jonson as another father who has left his son behind. There is also a gently humorous poem called His Prayer to Ben Jonson, where Herrick implicitly promises the kind of life immortal that he had promised Nicholas Herrick, that is his father, in To the Reverend Shade of his religious father. 2 of his poems remain upon Ben Jonson and in Ode for him. Okay, and Herrick's principal work is Hesperides, or the works both human and divine of Robert Herrick, Esquire, published in 1648. Following the restoration of Charles II, this is also an important event. You should know some of the historical landmarks in world history, in English history, because many questions are based on this. So, Charles II, restoration period, and after that Herrick was reinstated at Dean Prior, where he resided from 1662 to 1674. That was the year of his death. He never married, and many of the women mentioned in his poems are believed to be fictional. So, I was telling you that how important it is to know something about the English history, and one of the landmarks is the Battle of Agincourt, and this took place between England and France. Henry V was the king then, who came to the throne of England in 1413, and he resolved to revive the war against France and press his claim to the French throne. There were negotiations between the 2 countries where Henry made some preposterous demands, and French emissaries rejected them. On 24th October 1415, the English army marched through the Picardy town of Revon, within 30 miles of Calais, the French port of Calais, and on 25th October the 2 armies faced each other, and the English archers proved their superiority and the French were defeated. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, Henry was made regent of France and married Catherine, the French king's daughter. While all this was going on, there was something else happening. So, Joan of Arc, okay, when she was a French girl, a little girl, and when she was a teenager, she claimed to hear voices in her head. The girl rose from obscurity to champion Charles VII of France and led the French army to important victories during the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is something extremely important that you should know, one of the major events in English history, the 100 Years' War. Much of what we know about Joan of Arc, who burned at the stake, as most of us are aware of, in 1431, and it's also based on several misconceptions. Okay, her accounts are based on several misconceptions. There is no clear consensus of what really happened and why she did what she did. But what we know with some certainty is that Joan promised Charles VII that she would see him crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French royal investiture, and asked him to give her an army to lead to Orleans, then under siege from the English. Now, against the advice of most of his councillors and generals, Charles granted her request, and Joan set off for Orleans in March of 1429. She was dressed in white armor and rode a white horse. And after sending off a defiant letter to the enemy, Joan led several French attacks against them, driving the Anglo-Burgundians from their castles, from their forts, and forcing their retreat across the Loire River. In the spring of 1430, the king ordered Joan to confront a Burgundian assault at Compiègne. In her effort to defend the town and its inhabitants, she was thrown from her horse and the Burgundians took her captive. There was a trial. Joan was ordered to answer around 70 charges against her, including witchcraft, and also she was accused of the crime of dressing like a man. The Anglo-Burgundians were aiming to get rid of the young leader and also to discredit the king Charles, who was obliged to Joan of Arc for his throne. But he wanted to distance himself from an accused heretic and supposedly a witch. Therefore, he wanted to save his image, protect his image, and the French king made no effort or attempt to negotiate Joan's release. In May 1431, after a year in captivity, Joan relented and signed a confession denying that she was ever given any kind of divine guidance. However, later she defied orders and again donned men's clothes, and this time when she was captured, authorities gave her or pronounced her death sentence. At the age of 19, Joan was taken to the old marketplace of Rouen and burned at stake. Her fame, of course, increased after her death, and 20 years later, a new trial was ordered by Charles VII to clear her name. Joan of Arc has become a very recurring figure in literature of all languages. So, therefore, it is good to know something about her life and the major events, major episodes in her life. While this was going on in France, in England, there was someone called Thomas Wolsey, born in around 1470 or 71, and he died in 1530. He was the son of a butcher and cattle grazier. Thomas Wolsey graduated from Oxford University at the age of 15. He was ordained priest in 1498 and became a protege of someone called Richard Fox, who was the Bishop of Winchester and a leading minister in the court of Henry VII. Wolsey played a key part in organizing the successful French campaign of 1513. Now, Richard Fox at this time was eager to hand over the responsibilities of government service, and also Henry VIII, the new king, and Fox liked Wolsey and he wanted to hand over the responsibilities to him. So soon Henry promoted Wolsey first to the bishoprics of Lincoln and Tournai, then to the archbishopric of York, and finally making him or raising him to a very important position, that of Lord Chancellor in 1515. Wolsey enjoyed enormous power, control and wealth, but his failures in foreign policy indirectly contributed to his fall from power. Now Henry VIII, who was the ruler now, desperately wanted Wolsey to obtain a divorce for him from the Pope, and a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, who was his first wife. Henry VIII went on to marry 6 times. He wanted Wolsey to obtain from the Pope a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. One reason was that Catherine couldn't beget a son, and second reason was Henry VIII wanted to marry another lady in his court, that is Anne Boleyn. Now Pope Clement VII, he was under the influence of King Charles V, that is, who was Catherine's nephew, and Catherine was a Spanish princess. Wolsey could not find any way to persuade Pope Clement VII into granting the divorce. Henry VIII was extremely annoyed with this so-called inefficiency. Wolsey was arrested for treason in 1530 and died at St. Mary's Abbey, Leicester, on his journey towards the south on 24th November 1530. He was succeeded by Thomas Cromwell, also sometimes spelt as Cranmer. Cromwell was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was successful in annulling Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon and allowed him to marry Anne Boleyn. In January 1533, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, and in May, Thomas Cromwell or Thomas Cranmer dutifully declared the marriage to Catherine invalid, and also declaring Henry VIII and Catherine's only child, a daughter, Mary, illegal or illegitimate. A daughter was born to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, who was named Elizabeth, and she was born in September 1533. This was a time when Parliament framed a number of statutes between 1534 and 1536 that completed the jurisdictional breach with Rome and institution of the king as head of the English church. It was called the Act of Supremacy, which ousted Mary, Henry's daughter, and it successfully paved the way for the succession of Elizabeth to the throne. There was also something called the Treasons Act, which instituted the severest penalties for questioning these charges. Sir Thomas More, the author of Utopia, and Bishop John Fisher were two of the eminent men who would die under its provisions because they wouldn't agree. So this was the political climate in England just before the Elizabethan period. So, so much about history for today, and now let me go back to Shakespeare. We have been discussing Shakespearean histories, and before that I want to talk about one of the greatest plays ever written, Shakespeare's Hamlet, a tragedy written or composed somewhere between 1600 and 1601. Now this is also the world's most quoted play, and one of the most dramatic, featuring one of the most dramatic heroes in literature. with Hamlet, we get a hero who bristles with passion and introspection. Okay, he combines brooding intellect with lyrical sensitivity, a very unique hero in the history of any literature. The basic plot is that of a son avenging the murder of a father. Now, this is not, or this was not a very original plot. The theme of fratricide, usurpation of the throne, feigned madness, forged letters, all these things were already written and they all go back to a tale in a Latin, in the Latin language, which was called History of the Danes by a Danish cleric, Saxo Grammaticus. So, he had already written something like this, which delineating the plot of brothers brothers murdering their brothers and taking away their thrones and the queens, and princess feigning madness, forged letters, the duel between uncle and nephew, etc. So, Saxo Grammaticus had already done it. Now, this plot was also revived in a French collection, Tragic Histories, which was written in 1582 by someone called Belforest and dramatized on the English stage in 1581. It was a very popular play, and today it is referred to as the Hamlet, Hamlet, something that happened before. So, Shakespeare gave tragic finality and intensity both by depicting the character of his hero and by a series of parallel situations and characters with ironic duplications and contrasts. Notice how many duplications and contrasts exist in Hamlet. When he utters his famous lines, "Frailty, thy name is woman," it can be said of both Gertrude and Ophelia. Both are victimized by plotting males. Okay, so they may be frail, but they are also, or they may be frail. They may be of weak characters, but they are also victims. The most moving is the contrast between the quick remarriage of Gertrude to King Claudius, the brother king, and the suicide in the madness of spurned love by young Ophelia. And then also notice there is a parallel between three sons, the parallel of three sons, Hamlet, Laertes and Fortinbras, who eventually comes and takes over the anguished scene or kingdom, each son seeking to avenge a murdered father. Hamlet and Fortinbras both have been deprived of their thrones by their uncles, are the inheritors of a blood feud. You should remember that Fortinbras's father was also killed by the elder Hamlet and Laertes's father by Hamlet himself. So, there are too many deaths and too many fathers have been killed. So, all sons are there to avenge the murders of their fathers. There is a fight between Hamlet and Laertes, which is inevitable. Both die by the same poisoned sword or foil. Hamlet had recognized the essential similarities of their positions, because in one of the lines he says, "By the image of my cause, I see the portraiture of his." So, both of them mirror each other. Fortinbras, of course, it is said of him, he is of unimproved metal, hot and full, but he is not a weak character like Laertes, nor like Hamlet, who is rendered ineffectual because of his passionate and introspective intellectuality. As we all know, Hamlet is driven into misery by his father's death and the sudden remarriage of his mother Gertrude to his father's brother. He is disillusioned and he moves around in silence in in inky cloak and customary suit of solemn black. So, these are the famous lines from Hamlet. He is devastated. Now, his duty of revenge forces him to play a role essentially alien to his nature, because he is a philosopher, he is a romantic, he is an intellectual. It's not in his nature to go and kill someone. So, he needs a very solid evidence against King Claudius, and therefore the delay. He is too sensitive to commit the assassination or the murder of his uncle. Although it has all the elements of a revenge tragedy or a revenge tragedy, Hamlet's character is something that elevates the plot, the melodramatic plot, to the play that it is now. Hamlet's character is that of an idealized Renaissance prince. I keep talking about Renaissance, rebirth, a kind of coming out of the dark ages into the light. So culturally, scientifically, and politically, it was a new age, and Hamlet is truly a Renaissance prince whose courtiers, soldiers, scholars, eye, tongue, sword conform to the ideal of a gentleman. Look at the slide here, and these are the memorable quotes from Hamlet. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Though this be madness, yet there is method in it. To be or not to be, that is the question. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. And now we will talk about Shakespeare's histories. So, what we see in Shakespearean histories is not a medieval society, but Elizabethan and Jacobean society. Now, remember, although Shakespeare was writing history, quote unquote, using historical figures and events, what he was really doing was writing about the politics, entertainments, and social situations of his own time. Shakespeare does not attempt to reconstruct the historical conditions of this era. Rather, he imposes, for example, in his Tudor plays, all about Henry IV, Henry V. So, he imposes Tudor and Lancaster political theory on the events of the plays. Now, remember, some of his plays have an historical element. For example, the Roman plays are historical, but scholars do not include these Roman plays as history plays. These Roman plays are Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, but historians, Shakespeare scholars do not include them as history plays. The plays that we generally mean when we refer to the history are the 10 plays that cover English history from the 12th to the 16th centuries, particularly the period between 1399 and 1485. This is the period he covers. Each play is named after and focuses on the reigning monarch of the period. In chronological order of setting, these kings are King John, Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Henry VI, part 1, 2 and 3, Richard III and Henry VIII, although Shakespeare did not write them in that order. Henry IV, part 1, it has some of the most colorful characters ever. It is a history play which was composed in 1597. Now, this is one of a group of 4 plays beginning with Richard II and ending with Henry V that deal with material from English political history at about the beginning of the 15th century. Now, part 1 of Henry IV integrates actions that suggest comedy and tragedy as well as history, the historic in Henry IV and his political problems, the tragic in the Hotspur action. Hotspur is one of the central characters, and the comic in the Falstaff action. So, Sir Falstaff is one of the most memorable comic characters. although the true hero is Prince Hal, whose soliloquy we just saw, and he belongs to the historic vision of the nation state. But the historic view is dominant and requires the ridicule or humiliation of Hotspur, who threatens to be a tragic scapegoat hero. There is also a rejection of Falstaff in part 2, who threatens to dissolve the historical seriousness into comedy. Therefore, he has to be banished or removed from the play. At the beginning of the first part, Prince Hal seems to have accepted Falstaff as a model to imitate, although the very first speeches of the two point out a significant difference between their attitude towards the use of time, and Hal's soliloquy that we have just seen at the end of Act 1, Scene 2. It makes it clear to us, readers and the audience, that he has not permitted his association with the so-called Falstaff group to blind him to his historical mission. A word that frequently occurs is redeem. Okay. And it is used in both its theological and commercial sense. The contrast between leanness and fatness is also brought about, usually associated with good health and decay, corruption, decadence. The Falstaff is overweight, Hal is fit. Now, again in this play, discussions of time and honor, they furnish important clues for us to appraise Prince Hal and the various forces that surround him. This was one of the plays that established the English identity, what an ideal king should be, coming of age of an English king, that found its culmination in Henry V. Before winding up, do take a look at this video, the Elizabethan Age, available at this particular link. So, thank you very much.